Hello, my name is Dawn, and I'm here today at my home on Treaty 6 land, homeland of the Métis. I have a few pieces I'd like to share with you this evening from a book called The Moment, and they're really short little pieces in here by 125 writers and artists, and they're all about a page to maybe 3 pages long, about a moment in their lives. And I'm hoping to take us back a bit to our teen years. So I hope you enjoy this trip down memory lane today. The first piece is called Chalk Face by A.J. Jacobs. My 4th grade science teacher, Mr. Campbell, was a full-fledged, capital G grown-up. How could he not be? He was a teacher after all. You want further proof? He had a beard. At least, he seemed so grown up at the time. Looking back, he was probably just out of college, maybe 23, his beard wispy and thin. Mr. Campbell taught us science. Geology, climates, eclipses, the usual. Or he tried to teach us anyway. He spent a lot of time asking us to keep our butts in the seats and refrain from flatulent sound effects. The usual. One day we were being particularly rambunctious, but still, I didn't see it coming. It happened right after Stephen Fisher shouted his nonsensical catchphrase, "So-wee," for the 14th time. Mr. Campbell snapped. He pivoted from the blackboard where he was writing the characteristics of sedimentary rock and whipped that chalk right at Stephen's head. As soon as the chalk left his fingers, Mr. Campbell's face changed. He looked confused. He looked scared. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really shouldn't have done that." What? This was definitely odd. The teacher was apologizing to us, and the chalk hadn't even hit Stephen. It had flown right past his left shoulder. I'd seen grown-ups scream and shout and lose their temper, but saying sorry to kids and the fawn-like fright? It was the first time it really sank in that grown-ups are not flawless authority figures. They don't know what they're doing a lot of the time, 80% in my case. They're scared of consequences, like lengthy timeouts from their jobs. Mr. Campbell was lucky because we never reported his flip-out. I've forgotten what Mr. Campbell taught me about igneous and sedimentary rock formations, but the lesson about adults being screw-ups, that stayed with me. Which is why I believe you should treat grown-ups as you would 4th graders, with equal parts skepticism and compassion. Do you remember those moments when you first realized that your teachers are human, that they don't live at the school and they actually had lives and families and went shopping for groceries? Do you remember that first moment when you felt empowered to stand up for someone or something or a cause? This story is called The Bloodless Coup by Deborah Kopichin-Kogan. My teenage daughter showed up to my Orthodox Jewish father-in-law's funeral in a striped miniskirt and a pair of shit-kicker boots. It couldn't be helped. The black dress I'd bought for her 2 years earlier, as my young father lay dying, no longer fit. While Maurice, my 95-year-old father-in-law, was here one minute and gone the next, which left no time to shop. Jews being Jews, especially Orthodox Jews being Orthodox Jews, Maurice's body had to be buried within 24 hours, in a plot he'd reserved from a sect called Maria, pronounced as in, how do you solve a problem like? An apt question for this story. The Maria used to run an Orthodox shul in Manhattan's Upper West Side, just above Zabar's, which my father-in-law joined after a decade spent hiding from Nazis. He purchased the plot soon after arriving in America, because while Hitler was dead, you never knew about Nazis. Hours after Maurice took his final breath, the Maria representative contacted my mother-in-law to remind her that women, as per their misinterpretation of Halachic law, would not be allowed to the gravesite. This was not wholly unexpected news to the grieving widow, but it was, under the circumstances, not the most welcome news either. Her current rabbi, who, like the majority of Jews, even the most Orthodox, believes that shoveling dirt onto the deceased provides a necessary step in the mourning process, was called upon to try to broker a better deal. The negotiations between the two sides lasted well into the night, at which point the Maria rabbi finally broke down and agreed that the female mourners could accompany the body to the cemetery, so long as we remained hidden in the cars until the grave was 3/4 filled. I was told it had something to do with the possibility of contaminating the corpse with menstrual blood. Although, try as I might, I was unable to form a mental image of how such a defiling would occur without imagining scenes better suited to fetish porn. The next morning, during the ride from the funeral home to the cemetery, I was sitting in the back seat with my older 2 children when I realized that I had neglected to inform them of the whole girls have to hide in the car until the grave's 3/4 full deal. So I told them. "What are we, in the Stone Age?" said my 15-year-old son. My daughter could barely speak, the look on her face hovering somewhere between disbelief and the kind of rage for which animal tranquilizers were invented. Then it hit me. Here was a girl, or rather a woman, by Jewish law who had never, in her 13 years, rubbed against the absurdities of sexism. She'd never been told, as my mother once had, that only boys in the family could go to medical school. Her right to vote has always been sacrosanct. Her school cannot claim that they have no money for girls' sports. "But that's ridiculous," she cried. "I know it is, sweetie," I said, "but that's the deal that was struck, so we have to stick to it." At the cemetery, framed through the window of our car, a waddle of black-suited men encircled my father-in-law's grave, first rocking back and forth in prayer, then doing the hard manual labor of burial. I tried to distract my daughter from her anger with stories about her grandfather. "Remember the time when you were 5 and he asked you what your favorite sandwich was and you said prosciutto and brie? And then Bonneman said, 'That's not kosher.' And you said, 'What's kosher?'" My mother-in-law reminisced about the morning 2 decades earlier when Maurice had belted out the Marseillaise while being wheeled down the hallway for surgery. No one thought he'd survive. My sister-in-law told stories of her father's imprisonment in plain sight during the Holocaust, how he learned to take communion and say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," without sounding like an imposter. I wondered if anyone else in that car noticed the irony of our own imprisonment. 60 years later, in the back of that car. How complacently we wore the armbands of our gender without ripping them to shreds. Finally, from our hidden vantage point, the grave appeared to be 3/4 full, give or take a 16th. So we women, about 40 of us, many in the modest long skirts and post-matrimonial head coverings typical of Orthodox women, stepped out of the car and started walking towards the mound of earth. Which was when the black-hatted, white-bearded rabbi appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. "What are you doing?" shouted the rabbi, now running towards us, shooing us back to the car, physically blocking all those uteri from getting anywhere nearer the grave. "This is a disgrace! Get back in the car! Back in the car!" Clearly, no one had told him about the deal. My mother-in-law started to cry. The other women were shocked into silence. Which is when my daughter, all mini-skirted 4'10" of her, clomped up to the rabbi in her boots and said, "Excuse me, sir, but my grandmother would like to bury her husband. We had a deal. Now please move out of my way." Without looking back, she pushed her way past the rabbi and marched those boots straight toward the mound of dirt, where she yanked the shovel out of my husband's hand and thrust it deep into the earth. The rest of us women stood there, immobilized, not knowing how to proceed. Little Norma Ray could possibly be forgiven. Yeah, she was 13, but she looked no older than 10. Her uterus, one presumed, or at least one presumed the rabbi was presuming, wasn't yet shedding its lining. "Come on," she shouted, urging us with her hand. The rabbi from the cemetery stood his ground. "This is a disgrace," he kept saying. "Get back in the cars!" My daughter leaned on her shovel, her tiny frame dwarfed by it. Seeing her standing there, armed for battle amidst that sea of black, I took my mother-in-law's hand in mine, and we made a wide detour around the rabbi. My sister-in-law followed. A few seconds later, the entire amoeba of long-skirted women meandered its way toward the grave where, our bloodless coup thus complete, we grabbed some shovels and started digging. Do you remember the first time you got behind the wheel of a vehicle? The next story is called Take the Wheel by Piper Kerman. Do you want to drive? This question snapped my young self to attention. As I tore my eyes away from the open pastures, grown high with grass and wildflowers that were starting to disappear in the summer dusk, I looked at my uncle, the tallest and gangliest of my mother's brothers, who had asked the question. We were alone in his car together, him in the driver's seat, me in the passenger side. We were bumping down Shaw's Road, an unlit country lane that would soon turn to gravel as it led down the little New England cove where generations of our family have gathered every summer. It was dark enough that he had turned on the headlights. The beams bounced in front of us, scaring off adolescent rabbits. What? I wasn't sure if I'd heard right. Do you want to drive the car? I had never been behind the wheel of a car. Was at least a year off from being eligible for my learner's permit. It would never have occurred to me to ask to learn the so familiar yet mysterious workings of a vehicle, the clear purview of adulthood which seems so distant. 14-year-olds don't drive. It was against the rules. But suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to do just that. My mother's youngest brothers loved cars, a love perhaps inherited from my grandmother, who still spoke wistfully about a blue convertible she'd owned decades before. I couldn't believe that my uncle, closer in age to me than my mother, would let me drive his. And I couldn't imagine that this would be okay with my parents. In the dim light, I looked across his front seat at him, waiting for the offer to be rescinded. Yes, I said finally. He pulled over to the side of the road and put the car in park, still running. He got out and walked around the car, opened the door for me. I jumped out and ran through the headlight beams to hop into the driver's seat. I could see the shape of a stone farmhouse distant in the rearview mirror. The Volvo's tape player was on, probably The Police or Elvis Costello. As I stretched my feet towards the unfamiliar pedals of the floorboard, I really had no idea what I was doing. With coaching from my uncle, I nervously pressed my foot on the gas and turned us back onto the blacktop. There wasn't another car, nor another person in sight. Just me, a small teenage girl, trying to control what suddenly seemed like an enormous car. And now my visibly nervous uncle, swerving down that country road. If I started to run us off the road, he would grab the wheel and steer us straight. Somehow, I made a spectacularly wide right turn to get to the gravel that sloped down towards the cottage lights that edged the cove. 10 minutes earlier, I'd been a little kid, a passenger in a grown-up's car. But now I was something altogether different. In those glorious, gleeful moments when I urged that powerful engine forward, I also set out towards becoming a grown woman, directing my own fate, for better or for worse. When we had almost reached the cove, my uncle told me to pull over, and we switched places, back to where we had started. "Don't tell your mother," he said with a grin, as he switched off the ignition. Do you remember your friends from high school? Sometimes there was drama, sometimes there wasn't. Sometimes your best friend was your best friend all the way through school, and sometimes your best friends changed. The next story I want to read for you is Early Dismissal by Robin Wasserman. When you're a rational, clear-eyed, culturally conversant, healthy, mature, and stable grown-up, there are certain fundamental facts you know about the world. One of which is that 12-year-old girls come in only two varieties. The ones on the cusp of dumping their best friends, and the ones who will be dumped. The corollary to this is that it would be rather inappropriate for any rational, clear-eyed, culturally conversant, healthy, mature, and stable grown-up to care, much less still hold a grudge. I was born to be a dumpy, the epitome of quiet and bookish. with oversized glasses stuck to my face since nursery school, and an oversized helping of glee at any opportunity to be the teacher's pet. I was easily bored, easily charmed, and easily led. A ready-made sidekick to the school's resident, if relatively mild, wild child. I was also, having been reared on a steady diet of Anne of Green Gables, well versed in the pursuit and cultivation of kindred spirits, and desperate to get one of my very own. Once I finally did. It was as if I morphed into a 50s cheerleader who just scored a varsity bow, obsessed with the trappings of my new status. Instead of letter jackets, fraternity pins, and promise rings, I coveted friendship bracelets, science project partnerships, manic sleepovers, and above all, the best friend necklace, which could be broken into and worn by each of us as a badge of our unbreakable bond. But the reasoning behind it all was the same. These were talismans, proof to the world that I was no longer an I, but a we. Don't get me wrong, I liked my best friend well enough, but just not as much as I liked having a best friend, any best friend. I was a frightened child, not to mention an only child, and my best friend was my security blanket, the universe's guarantee that I would not face the future alone. She was also my mirror, a far more flattering mirror than the one hanging on the back of my bedroom door. Her very existence was evidence that I could not possibly be that ugly, that awkward, that unlovable. Because she was perfect. And she not only loved me, but loved me best. So you can imagine my surprise that 6th grade day in the playground, when lurking in corners, as I was ought to do, I overheard her casually tell some new group of admirers that, no, I wasn't her best friend, and why would anyone ever think that? That was it. No dramatic breakup scene, no slammed books, no rumor mongering, no cafeteria shunning, no mean girls antics whatsoever. Which was almost worse, because if I had become her worst enemy, it would at least have been an acknowledgement that I was once her best friend. Instead, from that moment on, I was nothing. It was the first time in my life it had occurred to me that kindred spirits might not last. That life, no matter how many talismans of attachment you accumulate, could be a constant struggle against being alone. There would eventually, at least, after I had crossed the social desert of junior high, be other best friends, better ones. But much as I may have believed in those friendships, I have never again taken it for granted that they would last. In the real world, the grown-up world, people leave, people die. People sometimes just get bored and move on to another part of the playground. Anything can happen. There are certain fundamental facts that 12-year-old girls know, while grown-ups, even the wisest of us, have forgotten. The name of Magellan's ships, the difference between mitosis and meiosis, the formula to calculate the volume of a cube, and the fact that BFF is not meant to be ironic. Knowing that no one's guaranteed to stick around has probably made me a better friend. And I'm certainly a better accessorizer now that I've left the ratty friendship bracelets and plastic necklaces behind. But I'll admit, I liked believing in forever. Perhaps some of you remember your first kisses. This next and last story for today is called First Kiss by Scott Muska. It happened on a fall afternoon in 1999, the year Clinton was acquitted of the Monica Lewinsky affair, and Ricky Martin was campaigning for the possession of every woman's heart in America, and maybe the world. I'd been gearing up for it all day. I was nervous, and extremely so. You wouldn't believe how nervous I was. Actually, unless you were a 12-year-old boy who was about to kiss a girl of no familial relation for the first time. Notes had been exchanged. In a rare moment of confidence and bravado, I had broached the subject in a note to Brittany, the apple of my 6th grade eye, that I had composed during second period social studies class. We'd been given a few moments of free time to get started on our homework, but I wrote instead. I wrote to her that I liked her so much I wanted to kiss her. It was one of those impulsive things a guy sometimes does to see if he can actually make something happen. I gave it to a friend who said he'd pass it to Brittany in the class they had together the next period, and then I walked around anxiously until the end of lunch, when she slipped me a response. It was on. She liked me, and she wanted to kiss me too. So we would kiss that day. In fact, she said we could do it after school, on the sidewalk where we said our goodbyes, before she walked to her sister's car and I got on the bus. I can't be 100% sure, but I'm fairly certain the moment after I read this note was the first instance in my life I ever executed a sweeping fist pump. At the end of the day, we exited our middle school building and clasped our hands together to make them look like a single person's 2 hands in a prayer formation, the more intimate method of hand-holding, and began walking. I remember how sweaty my hand was. My hands are constantly sweaty, but that day was even worse. She was calm though, and that helped. We reached the spot a few steps from my bus where we would part hands and ways on a daily basis, and we faced each other. Neither of us said anything. I giggled a little bit, like an idiot. And she just looked up at me and stood up on her tiptoes. I bent down slightly, and our lips met for a second. And it was the greatest I think I've ever felt in my entire life leading up until that moment. I drifted. I was floating away, thinking a peck was exactly what a guy gets for his first kiss, and that maybe I'd give the whole making out thing my brother was always talking about a try in another 3 years or so. But Brittany had a different idea. She brought her lips back to mine and we kissed again for another at least 5 seconds. I could have lived in those 5 seconds for the next 5 years. I remember tasting her Dr. Pepper flavored lip smackers balm and wanting to open my eyes just a little bit to see how beautiful a girl could be up close. Of course I didn't, because I knew a thing or two about kissing etiquette. There was no tongue involved, just 2 adolescents touching lips and moving them around a little bit. It was amazing. And I almost fainted when we parted, and I walked towards my bus, where I would sit for the next 20 minutes smiling like an idiot, while I tried to explain what just happened to my best friend, Evan. I can say it without any doubt. That was the moment that changed everything. I didn't become a different person, really, but something inside me was altered irrevocably. Kissing a girl was awesome, really, and it immediately became the most important thing in my life. It was a simple thing, really, one person's lips touching someone else's, but at the same time, it wasn't.